I've traveled more than 5,000 miles from Sweden to California to get away from the Danes, and still they somehow found me even here. This is the town of Solvang in California. It was founded in 1911 by 3 Danish immigrants who purchased 10,000 acres of land and settled here. It's located in the Santa Ynez Valley in California, and it has a bit over 6,000 people. It's called the Danish capital of America, as if that was something to be proud of. You might be wondering why I'm so antagonistic towards Denmark. Well, let me give you a history lesson. Sweden and Denmark are the 2 countries in the world that have had the most wars ever. You might think of Denmark, Sweden and Norway as a happy little Scandinavian family, but behind the smiling faces, there's hundreds of years of wars. That said, these days we're all Scandinavian and we love each other, like siblings. And just like siblings, we fight and we tease each other. But there's also a bit of old bitter hatred behind the jokes. But we also look out for each other. Swedes can make fun of Danes, but if anyone else attacks our brother, then things will get serious. Anyway, all of that is just to give you some context why I make fun of Denmark and the Danes. It's all a bit complicated, just like any real family. If you're into Denmark, there's a lot to see in Solvang. The houses in the town are inspired by 18th century Danish farmhouses. And you can find a lot of museums with Danish themes here, like the Hans Christian Andersen Museum. Hans Christian Andersen is of course the author behind many beloved fairy tales, like the Little Mermaid and the Snow Queen. And dozens more that Disney hasn't completely rewritten and made into movies. Yet, at least. This is the Hans Christian Andersen Park in all its glory. It's not much, but... yeah, it's not much. There's also an amber museum, which is quite fitting, since amber was dearly treasured by the Vikings. Oh, and speaking of Vikings, there's a Viking Museum as well, of course. There you can see 1,000-year-old Viking swords and an authentic Viking ship called Snorri. It's of course named after Snorri Sturlason, who wrote Snorri's Edda, a marvelous collection of Old Norse mythology. Even though Snorri was Icelandic and he had nothing to do with Denmark. At the museum you can also see a section about how the Vikings discovered America much earlier than that upstart Christopher Columbus. It's not the best Viking museum I've ever seen, but it's a lot of fun. If you're interested in the history of Vikings, I would recommend a visit to Birka instead, the Viking city outside of Stockholm. The museum and the reconstructions there are really good, but if you can't go to Sweden, then I guess this will have to do. Something that I'm quite excited about is all the Danish bakeries and restaurants that can be found in Solvang. First of all, we have to talk about the typical Danish pastry. You guys call them Danish pastries here in the US, but in Denmark and the rest of Scandinavia, they're called wienerbrød, Viennese bread. They became popular in Denmark during the 1850s when there was a strike among bakery workers. Bakers from Vienna were hired instead, and they brought with them this style of making pastries. So why are they called Danish pastries over here? My guess is that when Danish immigrants came to the US, no one could understand them when they said wienerbrød. Danish does sound like a drunk person throwing up with a mouthful of mashed potatoes after all. So people simply call them Danish pastries instead. I love how they call a Budapest pastry a Swedish delight. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? There's flødeboller and wienerbrød, but I don't see any cinnamon buns. Oh no, I was wrong. There are cinnamon buns, but they've done something horrible to them. They made them into American cinnamon buns with icing. I think I've explored every bakery in Solvang, and the only thing that you absolutely can't find is a proper cinnamon bun. I guess Americans simply don't like Scandinavian cinnamon buns. There's also a lot of æbleskiver, which are not slices of apple despite the name. It's pancake balls instead, because the Danish are weird. And I have heard that you can find rivalry as well, a Danish rice pudding of sorts. I haven't seen it anywhere though, and I can't even pronounce it to ask about it. And aside from all the baked goods, there's also a lot of Danish restaurants in Solvang. Let's have a look at some Danish restaurants. I'm curious to see what they have on the menu. I expect to see a lot of frikadellen and smørrebrød. Smørrebrød are Danish open sandwiches with a lot of toppings, and frikadeller are almost like Swedish meatballs, except they're bigger and Danish, and not quite as tasty. To be honest, I am pretty impressed by the Danishness of the restaurants here. Sometimes Europeans make fun of the US tendency to cling to their heritage. No one in Sweden would say, I'm 16% Danish, for example, mostly because they'd be run out of town. I have to admit that it's a little bit annoying when Americans go abroad and expect that their heritage will matter to any European. But on the flip side, it's quite charming to see a solid attempt at creating authentic Danish cuisine here. Now, this might be shocking to hear. Despite all of that, it's still just an attempt to mimic Danish cuisine. It's not truly authentic. You're not gonna get a taste of Denmark in Solvang. You'll get a Danish-American experience, but that can be pretty good too. If you didn't know it, Lego is a Danish invention. It's short for leg godt, play well. Viennese is a really cozy little store, but yeah, this much wine, that's not really Danish. They mostly drink beer anyway. Look at that, Leksands knäckebröd, Sweden represents. And there's even more, Vasa knäckebröd and Finnkrisp. It looks like Sweden is invading this little Danish town. This is such a typical Danish scene. Lots of cars, no bikes anywhere, shining sun, and palm trees in the background. Ah yes, the typical Danish dolphin wood carvings. That is definitely not something you'd ever see in Denmark. Solvang's homepage mentions that the town has an old-world European fairy tale-like feel, and that the town is full of Danish hospitality. Danish hospitality? I guess that means that people should be a bit standoffish and walk around half drunk. There's plenty of bars in town, for example a Copenhagen sausage garden, which incidentally sounds like something people would print on t-shirts for a stag party in Denmark. The Landsby is another bar, and you also have the Solvang Brewing Company. Unfortunately, I didn't really see any place that had Danish beers, except for one place that sold pancakes and Tuborg, which sounds like an unholy combination. But when in Denmark... Solvang means sunny field in Danish, and it's quite a lovely name. The town doesn't really have a fairy tale-like feeling in my view. It's borderline amusement park instead. Maybe it's because it tries to mimic the old Denmark instead of what Denmark has become. I'm used to Copenhagen and Helsingør and other Danish towns, but I haven't really seen anything that looks like Solvang. Solvang is a memory of a dream that Danish immigrants had when they came here. There's a small copy of Rundetårn here, and while it's quite nice, it's nothing compared to the original in Copenhagen. Walking up Rundetårn in Copenhagen was amazing, I loved it. But the tower here just mimics parts of the exterior, nothing on the inside. And it's quite small as well. I mean, look at it, it's tiny compared to the one in Copenhagen. There's actually an authentic Lutheran church here though. The church was built in 1928, and it was the first building that had a Danish design. Other houses started to adopt a Danish design after the church was built. So you could say that the church, even if it lies way off in the non-Danish parts of Solvang, is the heart of how Solvang looks today. Look at that, there's a Little Mermaid statue in Solvang as well. And it's just as unimpressive as the real thing. Julehus, the Christmas house, where it's Christmas all year round. It's actually not too dissimilar from any store in Scandinavia during Christmas. Except that they have some strange fascination with nutcracker figures here. We never see any of those in Scandinavia. Oh, and not singing Native Americans either. A Swedish candy store in Denmark, and here you can find polkagrisar, or candy canes. Also some salted licorice. Not even I like that. I wonder if that sells well over here. Solvang is as close to a Danish town as you can get in America, but it is still an American town. The shops are all American, and there's plenty of typical American restaurants. You can go on wine tasting tours around Solvang, something you definitely can't do in Denmark. The climate is nothing like Denmark either. This is way too warm and dry, even compared to a Danish summer. And also, there's cars everywhere, and overall the town is just very American. I've been on the road in California for close to 2 weeks now, and seeing Solvang doesn't really remind me of home at all. It reminds me of a foreign city that almost, but not quite, is entirely unlike Denmark. There's something called Danish Days that are celebrated here in September. I would have loved to see that and see more of this strange mix of Danish-American cultures. And it would be awesome to celebrate Midsummer here, or Christmas. Not because it's like Denmark, but because it's a lovely town and a fun town. If I were living in California, I could see myself coming here quite often for some of that almost but not quite nostalgia for home. And that's about it for this quick look at Solvang, a piece of Denmark in California. I hope you found it interesting. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day.